There's been a lot of confusion the last 24 hours when it comes to Europe's stance towards Palestinian civilians. What do you make of it?
Well, confusing indeed. There has been obviously some efforts that you just referenced by the EU and leaders to do some cleanup. And part of the confusion is because EU aid to Palestinians is very confusing. We have the EU aid itself, and then we also have the aid from member states. And we can talk about humanitarian aid, development aid, political aid, aid that goes to human rights organizations, etc. I think what is clear is when the initial decisions came out, or announcements, I should say, came yesterday, some of them were probably, I would say, more spontaneous and perhaps less well thought out than they should have been. And clearly, when one actually starts to look into the implications of cutting EU funding, one realizes that that would create even greater mess, especially in the West Bank, in terms of increasing the social, economic, political, and security collapse that we're seeing there. So I think there's now been an effort to pause, to take stock, and to try to not make things worse. But if I can just also add, when it goes to funding by member states or European governments, some of that might actually be, it's much less than the EU money itself, but I think that some governments may pause different aspects of their funding.
A lot of the spotlight's been on Germany because it's one of the big funders for the Palestinian territories. And we just heard, because right now there's a meeting of EU foreign ministers taking place, its top diplomat stating that there's no suspension. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that is indeed good to hear. And again, when it comes to the EU funding itself, to actually suspend that would require a decision by the 27 members, so it would require unanimity. And for those who follow EU policy in Israel-Palestine, there's hardly ever unanimity. So in the absence of that, the funding will continue, even if there is a big political and administrative battle that continues. But if I can also add, I would say that those budget lines that are most under threat, it's perhaps not humanitarian, but it's those budget lines that Israel has most objected to, specifically in terms of EU support for vulnerable Palestinian communities in Area C, in East Jerusalem, potentially also EU support for Palestinian human rights organizations such as Al-Haq and others that Israel has long targeted, and I think we can frankly say has long sought to smear with baseless accusations that they support terrorism. So I'd imagine that pressure, that campaign will very much continue.
It's not just in Israel. There seems to be here in Europe renewed scrutiny of that EU aid. How much of it is diverted towards militant groups?
Well, that's an easy question to answer, and the answer is zero. Israel has campaigned about this, has made this a big issue. It has, supposedly shared intelligence with European intelligence agencies. We haven't publicly seen all of it, but those who have seen it, the European intelligence agencies, have said that it's baseless. And let's also remember that EU aid to the Palestinians is one of the most heavily audited and monitored funding streams that the EU has. It's always audited. So there is, despite what Israel says, and despite also what the European Commissioner Oliver Vaheli may say, actually these allegations are to be found to be almost totally without basis and part of, I think, a broader political dynamic that we need to be aware of.
Hugh Lovatt, you wrote a paper in September for the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, where you posited that the European Union could leverage better how it distributes that aid. How so?
Absolutely. So no one doubts that there's big problems on the Palestinian side. And again, that needs to be contextualized within the broader context of open-ended occupation and Israeli actions. But certainly there is Palestinian agency, and we need to recognize that under President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority has gone from relative democracy, from free and fair elections in 2005, 2006, to authoritarianism. And we have to acknowledge that the PA is no longer representative. And is actually, no longer has benefits from the support of most Palestinians. So there's clearly a problem that needs to be addressed. And I think the problems with the allegations that we've been talking about is it detracts from these broader issues about the need to revive Palestinian institutions and democracy. So rather than cut funding, which will only be counterproductive and destabilize everything, let's look about how we can actually positively leverage this to encourage badly needed reforms on the Palestinian side. As I said, elections, defending the independence of the Palestinian judiciary, of recreating a legislative branch, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to recognize that European policies matter in this regard. So how do we adapt our policies to be able to also support this, whether it's pushing Israel to allow elections in East Jerusalem, but then also there's even more insanely complex question of like, how does one position oneself, how does one respond to Hamas, which despite what happens in Gaza, even if it is eradicated, which I don't think it will be, it will remain a political and ideological actor within the Palestinian scene. Clearly, it's now beyond the pale for Europeans, but it will remain a fact. And I think that will further complicate European discussions about how to push forward a badly needed reform of the Palestinian national movement.
You talked about Europe being always divided when it comes to the Middle East. I can tell you, Hugh, that France is divided as well. We've seen since last Saturday the left tearing itself apart over what stance to take when it comes to Hamas. What's it like on your side of the channel, and your thoughts on all of this?
I'm perhaps lucky or not to have had my head mostly in what's in the sad events in Gaza and actually not paid too much attention to domestic dynamics here. But certainly it is the same in terms of the polarization that one sees amongst the general public, protests for Israel, protests for Palestinians, and this happens every time there's massive violence. I think one needs to recognize, though, that there are certain dangers. The first danger is to equate all the pro-Palestinian sentiment, support for Palestinians, with support for Hamas. Support for Hamas is criminalized, actually, in the UK. There's a recent legislation that was passed. So I think it would be dangerous for the British government to start cracking down on those who demonstrate support for Palestinians. That's the first point. But I think, a simpler response would just be to have sympathy and compassion for both sides. I mean, this is not whataboutism. This is not about who is suffering more. I think it's clearly civilians on both sides are suffering heavily at the moment. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that ultimately, these two sides, it's cliche to say, but these two sides will have to live together at some point. And that ultimately you can't have security for one without security for the other, peace for one without peace for the other.